Hey guys, tonight we're taking a slow, savory stroll back in time, to a world where refrigerators didn't exist, mold was more enemy than metaphor, and survival often hinged on how well you could dry a fish. You're standing in a medieval kitchen. It smells like wood smoke, salt, and a faint whiff of something that's either fermenting or failing. Wooden barrels line the walls, each one a little mystery. On the long table sits a slab of meat half covered in coarse salt, as if someone decided to bury it right then and there. You wonder if it's food, art, or both. Either way, you probably won't survive this era with your modern gut. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And I'd love to know where you're watching from and what time it is. Drop it in the comments, it's always fun to see. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge into a medieval cottage just as the early evening sun begins to dip, casting golden shadows across the hard-packed floor. In one corner, a sturdy woman leans over a wide trough, dumping coarse, crystalline salt onto thick cuts of pork. The sound is soft but gritty, like sandpaper on raw wood. The meat will sit here for days, sometimes weeks, until it's leached of enough moisture to make it uninviting to bacteria, which, while unnamed in the Middle Ages, were definitely considered a problem, even if blamed on demons or bad air. Salt wasn't just a condiment back then. It was currency, power, and salvation all packed into tiny white grains. In fact, the word salary comes from the Latin salarium, money paid to Roman soldiers partly so they could buy salt. That's how deep the obsession ran. By the medieval period, entire economies hummed around it. Salt mines were precious, and salt roads, like the famous Via Salaria in Italy, wound through kingdoms like veins in the body. You might think a medieval peasant would just swing by the pantry and grab a pinch of salt like you do. But no, not quite. Salt was expensive, regulated, and in many cases taxed so heavily it was considered a luxury. Many peasants relied on locally harvested brine or bartered with neighbors who had access to saltworks. Salting a fish wasn't just preservation, it was planning for winter, or famine, or plague. The most common use of salt was for preserving meat and fish. You'd slice your meat thin, coat it thoroughly in salt, then stack it between wooden boards or in large ceramic crocks. Over time, the salt would pull out moisture and create an environment too harsh for microbial life to thrive. For fish, especially in coastal towns, salting was nearly ceremonial. Cod, herring, and eel were prime targets. By the time they were done drying in the salt air, they resembled something between shoe leather and hope. Here's a fun detail. Salted plums were also a thing. Not as common as salted meat, of course, but they existed. Some historians believe plums soaked in brine were used medicinally, possibly for digestive issues. Imagine popping a salted prune the next time your stomach feels off. History might be laughing softly in the background. Historians still argue whether salting was always done purely for preservation, or if it sometimes served a cultural or even spiritual purpose. In monasteries, for instance, salting meat might have coincided with religious fasting cycles or be woven into rituals of abstinence. Monks in some orders avoided fresh meat for moral reasons but didn't bat an eye at cured sausage. Interpretations, as always, were flexible. Now, while the science of salt preservation was solid, even if misunderstood in its time, there were still issues. Oversalted meat was tough, chewy, and often had to be soaked for hours before it was even close to edible. Peasants who couldn't afford enough salt would gamble, underpreserve, and pay the price with some very medieval food poisoning, or worse, starvation, if their winter stores spoiled too soon. But still you admire their commitment. Standing over that trough, working salt into every crevice of a haunch of venison with raw, calloused hands, this was care. This was survival with a dash of stubborn pride. And maybe that's the quiet heartbeat of the Middle Ages. Do what you can with what little you have, and don't let the meat go bad. You glance up at the timbered ceiling. A few hams hang from hooks, salted and smoked, waiting for their slow transformation into something safe. The cottage is quiet now. Outside, you hear the far-off bleat of a sheep and the creak of a distant cart. Inside, the salt keeps working in silence, invisible but essential. You lift the wooden lid of a ceramic jar and are greeted by an unmistakable scent. Sharp, vinegary, almost cheerful in its sting. Inside, floating like strange jewels, are carrots and turnips dyed golden by turmeric and steeped in a solution of spiced brine. Welcome to the pickling corner, where vegetables live forever, or at least until next winter. Pickling in the medieval world wasn't just for flavor, it was insurance. In a time when your garden yield could be wiped out by frost, hail, or a hungry goat, pickling gave you a backup plan that didn't involve starvation or chewing on shoe leather. The average household, especially in colder climates, would devote hours each week to the slicing, salting, boiling, and sealing of pickled goods. And yes, monks were especially into it, because if you're sworn to silence and modesty, spicy beets might be your only thrill. The basic technique was as familiar then as it is now. Boil some vinegar, often homemade from spoiled wine or ale. Add salt and herbs, pour it over your chosen victim, vegetable, and seal it in a jar. But here's the medieval twist. Nearly anything was fair game: eggs, fish, fruits, even flower petals, if you had a taste for the exotic. One recipe from a 14th century English household guide calls for rose petals pickled with cinnamon and white wine vinegar. Historians still argue whether anyone actually liked this, or whether it was just one noblewoman's misguided attempt at culinary creativity. Pickling also had social status. Poorer households made do with root vegetables and rough cider vinegar. Wealthier kitchens could afford imported spices, ginger, cloves, peppercorns, and their pickles came with flair. Imagine a table where pickled pears sit next to roasted boar, their sweet and sour flavor meant to cut the richness of the meat. It's basically medieval palate cleansing, minus the fancy sorbet. And then there's the legend of the pickle panic. In the early 1200s, a sudden rumor spread through a few European towns that improperly pickled foods could unleash swamp fever. No one really knew what swamp fever was, but it sounded unpleasant enough to trigger mass disposal of pickled stocks. For weeks, people buried their jars in pits and ditches. Some even tossed them into rivers, which ironically caused more problems. Was it real? Probably not. But it's a perfect example of how food preservation carried both hope and quiet paranoia. You reach for a crock of pickled onions and imagine the layers of time and effort behind it, harvesting at the right moment, peeling without waste, boiling vinegar by firelight, sealing the jar with wax or cloth soaked in fat. None of it fast, all of it intentional. Pickling was also community-based. Women in villages often shared equipment and recipes, learning through generations of slow experiments and whispered advice. If it hisses, it's happy, one might say, listening for the soft fizz that meant fermentation was working. Others swore by burying jars under hay for better flavor. The jury's still out on that one. Monasteries kept impressive pickling cellars. Monks, with their meticulous habits and access to steady supplies, often developed some of the most refined pickling techniques of the era. In fact, one 13th century Benedictine abbey is said to have produced a pickled plum so beloved that nobles would trade bolts of cloth just to taste it. Was it that good? Or were medieval nobles just very, very bored? Hard to say. What's clear is that pickling didn't just preserve food, it preserved identity. In remote villages, the taste of a particular pickle might distinguish your home from another's. Travelers would recognize regions by the flavor of their brine, and in winter, when fresh greens were a fading memory, biting into a crunchy, spiced beet was almost like opening a window to spring. You step back from the table now. The jars reflect candlelight, their contents colorful and oddly calming. Outside, the night has deepened. You can hear the wind nudging the wooden shutters and the faint rustle of straw on the floor. Tomorrow, someone will open one of these jars and serve its contents beside a hard heel of bread or a slab of salted fish. And they'll be glad. Because in a world ruled by the seasons, a well-made pickle was proof that you were paying attention and that you were planning to survive. The air is thick with the scent of hickory and damp wool as you step into a low, smoky outbuilding just behind the cottage. This is the smokehouse, medieval humanity's answer to the moldy cruelty of time. Hanging from the rafters like sleepy bats are slabs of meat, some wrapped in cloth, others bare, their edges darkened by weeks of slow aromatic smoking. The fire below isn't roaring. It's a quiet smolder, designed to kiss the food with smoke, not burn it. Smoking was, and still is, a preservation technique rooted in chemistry and stubborn practicality. It works by reducing moisture, just like salting, and by bathing the surface of meat or fish in compounds that make it generally inhospitable to the kinds of microscopic mischief makers that medieval people didn't know existed, but deeply feared. They may not have had pasteur, but they had patterns. Smoked meat keeps longer, was wisdom passed from grandmother to granddaughter, no lab coat required. The process is slower than you might expect. Cold smoking, the more common technique back then, could take days, sometimes weeks. Fires were kept low and steady, fed with chosen woods like oak, alder, or fruit tree trimmings. Each type of wood gave the food its own personality, so to speak. Pearwood smoke, subtly sweet. Cherry wood, a soft bite. Pine, a disaster. Always pine. And here's a tidbit. In some villages, it was believed that smoked foods absorbed the temperament of the smoker. If you cursed while tending the fire, your sausages might spoil. If you whistled, they might split. Historians still argue whether this belief was genuine superstition or just an early form of quality control, cleverly disguised as mysticism. Either way, if you were angry, you didn't get fire duty. The smokehouse was often the domain of older children or apprentices, people young enough to stay awake through the night but old enough not to burn the place down. They'd sleep in shifts, keeping an eye on the coals, occasionally turning the meats, and dozing off to the hiss and crackle of the fire. It was lonely, slow work, but essential. You spot something odd now. Smoked cheese. Yes, cheese. While less common than meat or fish, some regions experimented with smoking cheese as a way to firm up soft curds and extend their shelf life. The results? Mixed. There's a famous account from a merchant in 1321 complaining that the smoky rind burned my tongue and insulted my senses, which is probably the fanciest way anyone's ever said, I hated this. But smoked food wasn't just about surviving winter, it was also about celebration. In wealthier homes, smoked hams and sausages would be brought out for feasts, sliced thin to make them last. In poorer households, smoking a single rabbit might mean the difference between meat for a week or gruel for a month. And when done right, the result was delicious. Deep, savory, with a whisper of wood and fire. The kind of flavor that made you forget you were living in a world without antibiotics or reliable plumbing. Monasteries, again, were masters of the craft. With their controlled schedules, labor divisions, and obsessive record-keeping, they fine-tuned smoking into something close to an art form. Some abbeys even created smokehouses with multiple chambers, using flues and vents to adjust smoke levels. You imagine a monk, brown robe pulled tight, adjusting a vent with the concentration of a modern engineer, humming under his breath as he checks on sausages named after saints. And here's a quirky footnote. Some towns used communal smokehouses. Neighbors would take turns smoking their meat in a shared space, leaving marks or symbols on their cuts to identify them later. Inevitably, this led to arguments. There's a surviving court record from 1407 where two women in York fought over a smoked goose. One accused the other of tampering with her mark, which was apparently a carved star. The case ended with a fine, and the goose being split down the middle. That's one way to share. As the fire continues to crackle low, you sit near the door and let the scent soak into your clothes. It's rich, nostalgic, even if you've never smelled it before. There's something timeless about smoke, something patient. You imagine the food hanging above, slowly transforming under its touch, turning from raw vulnerability into something safe, something durable, a promise of tomorrow, wrapped in wood and shadow. Outside, Night has taken full hold. Stars peek through the thatched roof's gaps. The wind whispers through the trees. Inside the smokehouse, everything is still except the fire, and in that stillness you can almost hear the echo of 1,000 winters past, survived one smoked sausage at a time. You wake to the quiet rustle of morning. The smokehouse has long gone cold, and now you find yourself following a villager across a patch of dew-kissed grass toward something far less glamorous, but just as vital, a rickety wooden rack lined with strings of drying herbs, berries, and long curling strips of meat. This is the realm of air drying, the most passive-aggressive food preservation method of the medieval world. Just hang it up and hope the weather behaves. Drying food was arguably the oldest trick in the book. It required no fire, no vinegar, no elaborate tools, just sunlight, a breeze, and an unwavering belief that the cats wouldn't get to it first. And cats were always interested. They lurked on rooftops, beneath eaves, tails twitching with anticipation. For the moment, a careless breeze might knock a strip of rabbit jerky from its perch. You reach up and run a finger along a taut string of dried apples. Their edges are browned, their middles shriveled like tiny medieval moons. These were sliced thin, cored with care, and laid over linen sheets on sunny days before being strung up like garlands when clouds rolled in. Apple drying was a late summer ritual, performed with the urgency of someone who knew snow could show up before the harvest festival. Meat, of course, was also dried, especially in inland regions where salt was scarce and smoking impractical. One popular method? Suspend the cuts in high ventilated attics or near kitchen hearths where ambient warmth would do the work over time. The resulting jerky was tough as boot leather, but safe to store for months. Chewing it was less about flavor and more about survival and dental commitment. And then there's the humble sausage. Air-dried sausages were a marvel of science before anyone knew what science was. Ground meat mixed with herbs and spices, stuffed into animal intestines, tied with twine, and left to hang like plump punctuation marks across every cottage beam. Historians still argue whether these sausages were intentionally fermented, or if people just got used to the tang over time. Either way, if it didn't kill you, it stayed on the menu. A curious fringe practice involved drying fish by the riverside, tied between sticks like laundry. You'd salt them lightly, stretch them out, and let the wind do the rest. Problem was, birds loved this method. Entire flocks would patrol the riverbanks, turning preservation efforts into strategic warfare. In some coastal towns, children were paid in honey cakes to guard drying racks with sticks and shouts. Probably not the most relaxing summer job. The process of drying wasn't foolproof. Too much moisture in the air could spoil the whole batch. A sudden rainstorm might force a family to rush outside, scrambling to collect their drying food like laundry in a storm. And if you didn't dry things thoroughly, truly bone dry, they could mold in storage, leading to waste, hunger, and a long evening of blaming whoever was on drying duty that day. But when it worked, drying was the quiet champion of the medieval pantry. It turned surplus into security. Dried herbs flavored stews well into winter. Dried fruits became festival treats. Dried mushrooms were ground into powders and used as secret weapons in bland soups. It was slow, subtle preservation, never flashy, always faithful. You notice something tucked near the chimney, bundles of lavender and rosemary tied upside down. Beyond their use in flavoring and medicine, these herbs were also believed to ward off evil spirits and kitchen pests. 2 birds, 1 sprig. Was it effective? Maybe not, but it made the house smell wonderful, and belief has its own kind of power. As the sun rises higher, the drying racks warm in the gentle breeze. There's something deeply soothing about it all. The quiet commitment to patience, the knowledge that if you give food the time it needs, it will reward you with endurance. You step back into the cottage, ducking under hanging sausages like a guest at a very peculiar party. Over the hearth, bundles of leeks and wild garlic sway gently with the draft. Each item is a timestamp from warmer days, preserved with care and hope. And in that dim, herb-scented kitchen, Surrounded by the faded colors of dried bounty, you realize food wasn't just eaten in the Middle Ages, it was listened to, watched, and understood. Because when the earth sleeps, only the well-prepared keep feasting. The cottage kitchen is quiet now, but your eyes are drawn to a curious lump tucked into the far corner of a high shelf. It's sealed in waxed cloth and nestled in straw. The air here smells faintly sweet, like wildflowers and, oddly, syrup. You gently unwrap the bundle and uncover a small, glazed pot filled to the brim with thick golden honey. Buried inside, almost gleaming, is a small wedge of preserved fruit. You've just stumbled upon one of the Middle Ages' most delicious accidents: honey preservation. In a world without refrigeration, people got creative, and nothing was quite as enchantingly versatile as honey. Sweet, sticky, and naturally antibacterial, honey didn't just preserve, it embalmed. It sealed out air, drowned out microbes, and kept its contents pristine far longer than anyone in the 1300s could logically explain. But they knew it worked. You could dip herbs in it, bury fruits in it, even store strips of cooked meat in honey jars. It was like medieval Tupperware with a sugar high. And it wasn't limited to food. Ancient Egyptians famously used honey in cosmetics, medicine, and religious rites. That influence trickled through trade and storytelling into medieval Europe, where honey became the darling of both the kitchen and the apothecary. Historians still argue whether its popularity came more from taste or practicality. But either way, your average medieval cook knew how to wield it like a magic wand. Here's a strange little fact. Some noble households preserved delicate flower petals in honey. Rose, violet, and lavender were favorites, not just for their taste, but for their supposed calming effects. These floral honeys were served to guests during long, wintry visits, believed to settle the stomach and the nerves. Of course, we now know it probably just tasted like eating perfume, but you can't knock a culture for trying. You peer into another pot and find something less elegant, a lump of garlic and chopped onions swimming in darkened honey, a medicinal blend. Recipes like this show up in monastic texts, where monks recorded preservations as both food and cure. A spoonful might be served for sore throats, bad humors, or after an unfortunate tavern brawl. The line between pantry and pharmacy was fuzzy, and honey often sat right in the middle. But even peasants made use of this golden glue. Though sugar was expensive and exotic, honey could be harvested locally, and villages often kept hives near orchards or along hedgerows. Beekeeping was considered both an art and a practical skill, quiet, patient, and not for the faint of heart. Getting honey meant risking a few stings and knowing just how much to take without angering the hive. One 14th century English account mentions a farmer named Edith who carried honey in her apron, whispering to the bees that it was for winter bread. Whether or not they listened, she apparently had the best preserved apples in the parish. And let's talk about apples. While drying was common, another method was honey dipping. Slice them thin, coat them in warm honey, and set them in clay pots to steep. The result was a chewy, almost candied treat that would hold up through months of damp and chill. Add a few nuts, and you had something dangerously close to trail mix, medieval style. But perhaps the most fascinating use of honey in food preservation was its role in funerary customs. Some sources from the Byzantine world, and later from Eastern Europe, describe entire animal carcasses preserved in honey for long-distance transport. Whether they were meant for feasts or rituals remains up for debate, but imagine opening a pot and finding surprise goat. You glance at the little wedge of fruit you uncovered earlier. It's soft but not mushy, sweet but still sharp. Thyme, trapped in sugar. You take a deep breath. The room is warmer now, and the honey reflects the firelight like a pool of amber. And here's a thought to chew on as you watch the light flicker across the jars. Honey never spoils. Not really. Archaeologists have found pots of it in ancient tombs, still edible after thousands of years. It might crystallize, it might darken, but it remains food, patient, sticky, and slightly smug about its own immortality. You gently reseal the pot and return it to its straw nest. It sits there, quietly guarding its treasure, unchanged by time and untouched by decay. In a world where everything seemed fleeting, seasons, harvests, even health, honey whispered a promise. Not everything good has to fade quickly. You sit now at a long, slightly uneven table in the shadow of a monastery's kitchen wall. The scent of sourdough, stone, and something bubbling lingers in the air. A monk shuffles past with a heavy wooden bowl, muttering something about turning at the right hour. You glance into the bowl and find yourself nose to face with a frothy, slightly suspect mixture. Congratulations, you've entered the strange, glorious world of medieval fermentation. Fermentation wasn't just about flavor. It was preservation, transformation, and a little bit of blind trust. When done right, it extended the life of food by weeks or months, making the difference between hunger and security. When done wrong, well, let's just say the results ranged from mildly exciting to a lesson you never forgot. Take sauerkraut, for example: cabbage, salt, and thyme. It was popular in Central and Eastern Europe, and not just as a condiment. It was survival food. The brine created during the process kept harmful bacteria at bay, while the good bacteria, the kind with names no medieval person could pronounce, went to work transforming the cabbage into a tangy, crunchy miracle. Add a dash of juniper or mustard seed, and you had something worthy of a monk's approval, or a peasant's dinner. But fermentation didn't stop at vegetables. Grains, too, had their turn. Porridge left out overnight often became sour, and in some places, that was considered an improvement. Fermented grain mush was known by many names: sowans, gruel, fermented pap, and was usually served warm, with honey if you were lucky, or a splash of ale if you weren't. Historians still argue whether early medieval cooks truly understood fermentation, or simply played the odds with slightly spoiled food. Did they sense the invisible transformation of bacteria and yeast, or just develop good instincts by trial and occasional intestinal error? The answer probably lies somewhere in between. Let's just say taste testing was an occupational hazard. One charmingly odd tidbit: some monks believed that certain foods fermented better when hymns were sung over them. One recipe for blessed barley ale insists that the brew be stirred clockwise while chanting psalms. Was this spiritual seasoning or clever timekeeping? You decide. Now, if you're feeling adventurous, let's talk fish sauce, specifically garam's stinkier cousin. While garum was a Roman staple, its influence lingered well into the early medieval kitchen. Some coastal regions made fermented fish paste from anchovies, sardines, or even herring, aged in clay pots with herbs and sun. The result was salty, umami-rich, and, as travelers recorded, often so pungent it could clear a room. Some historians argue it was still in use much later than previously thought, quietly stinking up storage rooms well into the 11th century. Fermented dairy was also a staple. Yogurt, kefir, sour milk, whatever you want to call it, if you let fresh milk sit in the right conditions, it transformed. Peasants often relied on sour milk as a base for stews or as a drink. And while the modern mind recoils slightly, medieval people appreciated its tangy depth and, more importantly, its reliability. Fresh milk spoiled. Fermented milk persisted. Even fruit didn't escape the bubbling cauldron of medieval fermentation. Apples left in barrels turned to cider. Grapes became wine. And plums soaked in brine might ferment into something interesting. Whether drinkable or dangerous, you had to taste and find out. Some households even had fermenting corners, sections of the cellar where jars and pots were left undisturbed, each one a little gamble. But not everything was intentional. Accidental fermentation happened often, especially in hot weather. A loaf of bread might sour before baking. A pot of stew might bubble overnight. Families often decided to eat it anyway, especially if hunger outweighed caution. And yet, sometimes these accidents became traditions. What began as a mishap turned into a recipe passed down for generations. You glance again at the monk's bowl. The froth has quieted, and the scent is less aggressive now, richer, almost bready. It's alive in the most literal sense. And that's what fermentation was, really: a dance between food, air, and time. A partnership with nature unpredictable but rewarding. Outside, a soft breeze wafts through the stone arches of the cloister. You can hear distant footsteps, the hum of bees in the herb garden, and somewhere, faint singing. The air smells faintly of vinegar, flour, and hope. And as the light dims, you're struck by the thought that fermentation, bubbling quietly in dark corners, was the heartbeat of medieval kitchens. Messy, misunderstood, but absolutely essential. The sun has dipped lower now, casting long shadows across the fields, and you follow a crooked stone path behind the main cottage to something that looks like a burrow for very organized badgers. But this, dear sleepy traveler, is no animal lair. It's the root cellar, or perhaps more accurately, one of several types of medieval cold storage. Welcome to the underground world of preservation without ice, plugs, or buttons. Just cool air, damp stone, and a lot of hope. You duck your head and step inside. The air shifts instantly, cooler, denser, tinged with the earthy smell of dirt, straw, and old onions. Your eyes adjust slowly, revealing shelves lined with pottery jars, baskets of knobby vegetables, and a few sacks stacked neatly in the corners like medieval beanbag chairs. No torches here. That would be asking for disaster. Just the glow of the sun trailing behind you and the ambient chill rising from the earth. Root cellars were simple in principle but brilliant in practice. They harnessed the earth's natural insulation to keep perishables from, well, perishing. A constant cool temperature, just above freezing in winter, tolerable in summer, meant food lasted longer, whether it was a wheel of cheese, a bunch of leeks, or a particularly smug turnip. The architecture varied. Some were dug directly into hillsides. Others were shallow pits reinforced with stone and wood, topped with turf roofs like green eyebrows on the landscape. Some were even under homes or barns, accessible by trapdoors, their secrets hidden from the curious or the hungry neighbor with wandering hands. And oh, the labeling system. In theory, each jar, pot, or sack was clearly marked using painted signs or carved wooden tokens. In reality, well, let's just say opening a sealed jar was sometimes a surprise party. Is this cabbage or plum chutney? Was not always answered with confidence. Historians still argue whether any true cataloging system existed, or if medieval storage was just a very elaborate memory game. You notice one barrel in the corner, slightly sunken in the floor. A quick peek reveals apples, stored carefully in layers of straw and dry leaves. This method, storing fruit with space for airflow and protective padding, was one of the gentler techniques. The goal wasn't just cold, it was moisture control. Too dry and things shriveled, too wet and things rotted dramatically. It was a balancing act that required instinct, trial, and an occasional slap from Mother Nature. Then there's the smell. Not unpleasant, just earthy. A mixture of beetroot, old clay, and the lingering ghost of last season's potatoes. It's a living space in its own way. Every object here is breathing slowly, aging softly. Even the jars with wax seals seem to hum with potential. Some cellars had distinct zones, drier corners for onions, slightly damper ones for root vegetables, and up near the entrance, shelves for dried goods and odds and ends, like the half-used jar of goose fat no one wants to admit they forgot last spring. And let's not forget the hanging meat. In colder months, the cellar doubled as a meat locker, strings of sausages and smoked bacon dangling like festive high-calorie garlands. One particularly curious trick used in some regions was burying ceramic pots of preserved food directly into the ground floor. The earth kept them cold, and a flat stone on top deterred pests and nosy children. Some families marked their pots with wax seals and a twig code. Was it effective? Questionable. But charming? Absolutely. And here's a quirky little tidbit. In a few noble households, underground cellars were connected by tunnels. These weren't grand passageways, more like tight, candle-lit crawl spaces between kitchens, pantries, and wine stores. One surviving letter from a lady in 15th century France complains that the pickled pears took 2 hours to locate on account of the kitchen boy getting lost and crying into the beetroot, which honestly feels very relatable. Back in your current root cellar, you crouch beside a basket of parsnips, their white skins dull in the dim light. Nearby, an open jar reveals fermented carrots steeped in brine and dill. The air is still, quiet. You can almost hear the whisper of breath from the vegetables themselves, sleeping, preserved, waiting. And isn't that the essence of it? A space carved into the earth, built not for glory, but for patience, for readiness, for the soft, slow magic of keeping things just long enough. You rest your hand on the stone wall, cool to the touch, and listen to nothing at all. Just the silence of centuries-old ingenuity doing what it does best, holding on. You climb slowly from the earthy hush of the root cellar, stretching your limbs into the fading afternoon light. A villager waves you over to the far edge of the clearing, where several children are packing straw around something that looks suspiciously like a pile of snow wearing a hat. But it's not just snow. It's precious, hoarded ice. Welcome to the strange and chilly realm of medieval refrigeration, or at least the closest thing to it. You'd think a world without electricity would have no need for ice. And yet, from China to Persia to parts of Europe, people found clever ways to trap winter's chill and stretch it deep into summer. These weren't accidental discoveries either. Ice was intentionally harvested, stored, and used not just for cooling drinks, though yes, that happened, but for preserving food, soothing fevers, and impressing important guests. Let's begin with the ice house, a deep shaded pit or stone structure insulated with straw, packed earth, or even animal dung, which, to be clear, was not in the official sales pitch. These storage chambers were often built into hillsides or sunk into the ground, where sunlight couldn't reach and cool air clung like a loyal friend. Large blocks of ice or compacted snow were collected during the coldest months, sometimes carted in from mountains, and stacked like treasure. And yes, people really went to this trouble. In northern climates, lakes and ponds were carved into slabs of ice with long-handled saws, and entire village crews would haul them away for storage. It was a winter ritual, as much about communal effort as future refreshment. In warmer regions, especially in parts of the Islamic world, yakhchals, ancient Persian ice houses, were marvels of engineering, using wind towers and thermal insulation to keep things frozen in desert climates. Historians still marvel at how these early refrigerators worked so well with no moving parts and no power grid. In medieval Europe, storing food in snow or ice was rarer, but not unheard of, especially in monasteries or noble homes. Monks, ever practical and slightly alchemical, would store small clay pots of dairy, fruits, or cooked meats in ice-filled chambers or snow-packed boxes. It wasn't everyday fare. It was a luxury, used mostly for fragile items or medicinal foods. And let's not forget snow cream, which was very much a thing in certain parts of Italy and France during the later Middle Ages. Mix clean snow with honey and crushed berries. You've got yourself a moment of divine intervention on a spoon. Of course, one had to be careful. Snow near the pigsty was discouraged, even if it looked fresh. That particular lesson probably only needed learning once. There's even a surviving account from a 13th century Florentine merchant who bragged about cooling his wine with mountain snow fetched by mule, a flex by medieval standards. Historians still argue whether this was common practice or an early form of culinary theater designed more to impress guests than to preserve anything useful. Either way, it sounds delicious. Some noble estates employed dedicated ice stewards whose entire job was to manage the ice supply, ensuring it didn't melt too quickly, checking for spoilage in nearby foods, and perhaps most importantly, keeping small hands from turning it into snowballs. A tough job, especially during warm spells. For everyday people, ice was less about long-term storage and more about quick fixes. You might pack snow around a fish to get it through a warm afternoon, or press chilled stones against milk jugs to delay curdling. Improvisation was everything. And when the ice ran out, back to salting, drying, and praying. You kneel now beside a small clay pot tucked into the snow mound. Inside, nestled like a pearl, is a pouch of milk wrapped in cloth. It's cool to the touch, shockingly so, and probably destined to become soft cheese or breakfast porridge. There's a calm, eerie beauty to this scene. The snow doesn't sparkle. It glows softly in the dying light, edged by the shadows of wooden tools and quiet children. You watch one of them gently pat the mound down, like tucking in a sleeping guest. And here's a small, curious fact to end on. In some mountain villages, snow was considered a blessed preservative. Parents would tell children that anything stored in snow would sleep peacefully until needed, a poetic way to explain thermal insulation, and possibly a bedtime story to encourage proper food storage. You rise, brushing straw from your hands. The snow mound remains, a fleeting miracle against the backdrop of dirt, fire, and labor. It won't last, of course. It will melt, fade, vanish. But for now, it guards its contents with chill devotion, preserving not just food, but a little pocket of wonder. The path to the seaside is uneven beneath your feet, but the breeze brings with it a briny comfort and the unmistakable promise of dinner. Or at least, something that used to be dinner several weeks ago. As you near the bustling docks, the smell hits you. Salt, fish, old wood, and the kind of tang that clings to your cloak no matter how tightly you wrap it. Welcome to the empire of salt cod, the unlikely king of medieval preserved seafood. You stop beside a long, sun-bleached table where rows of cod lie stiff and pale like ancient scrolls. Their surfaces are crystalline with salt, their skins tough enough to crack. These aren't the soft, flaky fillets you know today. These are battle-hardened survivors, preserved to outlast storms, seasons, and the occasional siege. Salt cod, or bacalao as it's still lovingly called in parts of Europe, was more than a meal. It was a miracle of preservation. Caught in cold northern waters, gutted and cleaned almost immediately, the fish was packed in heavy layers of coarse salt and pressed under planks and stones. This leached out moisture and locked in the flesh. After a few weeks, the fish would be removed, rinsed, and set out to dry in the sun. The result? Something as light as wood but dense with calories and history. And here's the kicker, it could last for years. Imagine hauling sacks of it across mountain passes or stuffing it into ship holds bound for the Holy Land. No need for ice or speed. As long as it stayed dry, it stayed food. Historians still argue whether salt cod preservation was first mastered by Basque sailors or Norse traders. Both had the right geography and a knack for logistics. What's certain is that by the 12th century, salt cod was showing up far from its oceanic origins, turning up on medieval menus deep inland, where fish hadn't swum in centuries. In monasteries, it became a Lenten staple, a fish that didn't spoil and didn't make the monks question their vows. Too much. But cod wasn't alone in its salted travels. Herring, eel, anchovies all met similar fates. Entire economies developed around the salted fish trade. Coastal towns in England, France, and the Low Countries became preservation hubs, with fleets dedicated to catching and salting, and entire street markets devoted to pungent wares. One delightful and slightly tragic fringe account tells of a 14th century German cook who soaked a chunk of salt cod for 2 full days, only to discover it was a wooden decoy used for training apprentices. He served it anyway, claiming, "The chew builds character." His guests reportedly agreed. And soaking, let's talk about that. You couldn't just toss salt cod into the pot and hope for the best. Rehydration was a ritual. The fish had to be soaked in fresh water, sometimes for 2 or 3 days, with regular water changes to reduce the salt. Only then was it boiled, stewed, or shredded into pies. Even then, it remained assertive. A strong personality on the plate, but it fed families. It kept ships afloat. And it gave fasting monks something to chew on that wasn't spiritual. One lesser-known gem? Fish pies with preserved cod and raisins. A sweet and savory combination that made it into court feasts and fancy banquets. Historians suggest the raisins helped balance the fish's saltiness, or distract from its leathery texture. Either way, it became weirdly popular. As you watch a merchant tie up a parcel of cod with twine, you spot a tiny wax seal stamped with a fish and star symbol. Merchants marked their dried fish to track trade routes and origin. Some symbols became so trusted that buyers would pay extra for a particular stamp, kind of like a medieval Michelin star, but smellier. You walk the docks now, stepping past barrels and baskets and wide-eyed cats hoping for a dropped scrap. A boy rinses fish in seawater. A woman dusts salt from her apron. And above it all, the seagulls cry, always ready to intervene. Salt cod was rarely glamorous. It didn't puff or shine or sizzle in pans. But it was dependable, portable, and shockingly democratic. It crossed class lines, languages, and borders. It filled bowls and bellies and ships for centuries. And even now, as you look at its pale, hardened surface, you sense the quiet dignity of something that simply does its job, and does it for a very, very long time. You leave behind the salty tang of the docks and head inland, following a dusty trade road that winds through small villages and quiet meadows. Along the way, you pass travelers, some cloaked, some barefoot, all carrying satchels, pouches, and bundles that rustle softly with the sound of dried beans and wrapped bread. Tonight we follow the rations of medieval wayfarers, pilgrims, and wandering souls. Because food preservation didn't stop at the homestead, it had to travel too. The average medieval journey wasn't a quick jaunt to the next town. Roads were unpredictable, inns were inconsistent, and the chances of finding a hot stew along the way hovered somewhere between slim and optimistic. So travelers packed smart and packed preserved. You open a weather-worn satchel and find a small loaf of hardtack. It's dense, dry, and could easily double as a weapon. Baked multiple times until all moisture fled in terror, hardtack was a mainstay for long-distance travelers. It didn't mold. It didn't spoil. It didn't taste like much. But with enough ale or stew to soak it, it could sustain you through several miles of questionable decisions. Pilgrims, especially those headed for faraway holy sites like Santiago de Compostela or Canterbury, often carried dried peas or beans. Lightweight, durable, and easy to cook over a fire, assuming you had time and a pot. Travelers might also bring slabs of salted bacon, lengths of dried sausage tied to their belts, or even wrapped slices of smoked cheese. These were precious, rationed carefully, and often shared only during moments of celebration or utter despair. A delightful tidbit: some folks packed journey eggs, hard-boiled eggs dipped in wax or wrapped in cloth soaked in vinegar. This extended their shelf life by a few days and made for a protein-rich snack. Historians still argue whether this was a widespread technique or a niche culinary hack passed through local wisdom. Either way, the idea of unwrapping a pickled egg on a mountainside at sunrise feels oddly poetic. Then there were pasties. No, not the modern ones filled with steak and gravy, but thick-crusted medieval hand pies designed less for deliciousness and more for durability. The crust, often too tough to eat, acted as a container, keeping the fillings, meat, dried fruit, root vegetables, from spoiling. Some even came wrapped in waxed cloth or stuffed in earthen jars for extra protection. Perfect for travelers with more horse than time. Monasteries along the road often provided food for pilgrims, and their offerings leaned heavily on preserved staples: lentil soup, stale bread, pickled vegetables. If you were lucky, you might get a preserved plum or a chunk of nut-studded fruitcake, also known as marchpane in its earliest forms. High in sugar and fat, it doubled as a dessert and an energy boost before a steep climb. And let's not forget travelers' wine. Not the rich red stuff for noble feasts, but thin, tart, slightly vinegary table wine stored in goatskin pouches or wooden flasks. It was safer than water, most of the time, and it didn't take much to turn a long march into a slightly more cheerful stumble. You notice now the pack of a merchant resting against a tree. It jingles faintly. Not just coins, but little clay pots sealed with wax. Inside, preserved herbs, perhaps, or a medicinal blend of honey and vinegar. Traveling apothecaries were known to carry such mixtures, helpful for upset stomachs and suspicious meat pies. And yes, there were sweet options too. Some preserved fruits, like figs or dates, traveled well when packed in oil or dusted in flour. They were rare, precious, and probably hoarded until morale dipped low enough to justify a bite. Kind of like emotional support rations. As twilight falls, You sit beside a low fire built from twisted twigs and dried cow dung, just enough heat to warm a pot. A traveling friar offers you a taste of his pilgrim's mash, a stew of lentils, dried leek, and salted rabbit jerky. It's salty, it's chewy, it's edible. And it tastes of the road itself, hard, honest, and somehow comforting. You sip weak wine from a horn mug and stare into the flames. In the quiet, you realize preserved food wasn't just about survival. It was companionship. It was the familiar weight of home in a stranger's landscape. It was something constant when everything else was uncertain. And as the stars creep out overhead, you listen to the crackle of fire and the gentle clink of dried beans in a leather pouch. A lullaby for travelers, written not in notes, but in nuts, grain, and salted meat. You wake with the sunrise peeking through the branches and the sound of birds debating something urgently overhead. The embers of last night's fire still whisper warmth, and your fingers reach for a small parcel tucked carefully into your satchel. Wrapped in linen and tied with twine, it crinkles softly as you unwrap it, revealing a glistening jewel of preserved fruit, soaked in syrup and studded with cloves. Sweetness, in a world that often lacked it. This is the sugarcraft of the Middle Ages. Preserving fruit with sugar, or with its rustic cousin, thick-boiled honey, wasn't just culinary convenience. It was alchemy, transformation, the delicate process of suspending nature's bounty in a syrupy stillness that defied decay and danced on the tongue. At its core, the process was simple. Take fruit, plums, cherries, quince if you were lucky, and boil it gently with honey or later, when the colonies and trade routes grew bold, with imported cane sugar. Add spices, cinnamon, clove, maybe ginger, and cook it down until the liquid thickened and the fruit gleamed like glass marbles. Once cooled, it was packed into ceramic jars or glazed crocks, sealed with wax or cloth, and stored in cool pantries. A luxury? Absolutely. But one often saved for winter feasts or unexpected guests. And here's the thing. Sugar was rare. It trickled into Europe along trade routes like something sacred, handled more like medicine than a pantry staple. The first large-scale sugar use appeared in apothecaries, where it helped make bitter medicines more palatable. A spoonful of sugar wasn't just a catchy tune. It was survival for sour potions and strange powders. But nobles got wind of this sweetness and, well, nobles will noble. Soon, court kitchens were producing elaborate preserves, candied orange peels, ginger roots, and even flower petals suspended in translucent glaze. These sugary marvels were presented on silver platters at feasts, eaten in tiny bites like edible jewelry. Historians still argue whether their primary purpose was flavor or flexing. Likely both. For the less affluent, honey continued to serve as the main preserving agent. But even then, the results were impressive. Boil apples in honey, toss in a pinch of sage, and you had a preserve that could last weeks, months, if sealed well and hidden from curious children. Some peasant families made fruit leathers, pulped berries spread thin on wooden boards, dried in the sun, then rolled and stored. They were chewy, tart, and wonderfully portable. The medieval version of a fruit roll-up, minus the cartoon mascot. A charming fringe practice from some parts of Italy involved suspending figs in wine syrup and storing them in sealed flasks like sweet pickled ghosts. Travelers would bring these on long journeys, popping one when spirits or blood sugar ran low. There's even a record of a monk in 1328 smuggling a flask into a fasting retreat and arguing that fruit and wine is simply communion in a different bottle. He was reprimanded, but not exiled. That fig must have been convincing. You find another jar tucked in the shade, this one labeled with a charcoal sketch of a pear and a crescent moon. Inside, spiced pear preserves. The syrup clings to the fruit like silk. The scent is mellow, nostalgic. You dip a wooden spoon and taste, soft, sugary, warm with cinnamon. It's like eating a memory. And while fruit preservation brought joy and color to meals, it also served strategic needs. Sailors packed dried and preserved fruits to combat scurvy. Nobles stored sugared plums for winter months when fresh produce was scarce. Monasteries cataloged their jars in tidy Latin, noting batch dates and prayer schedules. There was a rhythm to it, a recognition that sweetness could be both pleasure and protection. As the sun rises higher, casting golden beams across the field, you sit beneath a tree and nibble another sliver of preserved quince. The world feels quiet here, balanced. And it occurs to you that in a time before refrigeration, before sealed bags and factory stamps, sweetness was something earned, measured, crafted, and kept with care. You wrap the linen back around the jar and place it gently into your bag. It's not just food, it's a promise that even in the leanest seasons, a little warmth, a little joy could be saved and savored. You've wandered far from the orchard sweetness of preserved fruits, and now you find yourself in a barn-turned dairy tucked beside a gentle creek. The air here is different, cool, a little musty, with a sharp tang that curls up into your nose and settles there. Rows of wheels rest on wooden shelves, some gray with age, others pale and new. Welcome to the medieval art of preserving milk by turning it into cheese, also known as edible alchemy, aged to perfection. Cheese wasn't just a food in the Middle Ages. It was a strategy, a way to trap nutrients, extend shelf life, and, let's be honest, keep cows relevant through the seasons. Fresh milk spoiled fast, especially without cold storage. But curdle it, press it, salt it, and let it breathe in the cool stillness of a cellar. Now you had something that could last months, sometimes even years. The process, though rougher around the edges than modern standards, was shockingly effective. Milk was warmed, sometimes with the help of animal rennet, sometimes with fig sap or nettles for the more herbally inclined. Curds were cut, drained, and pressed using cloths and carved stones. The resulting mass was salted, shaped, and then aged in cool, dark spaces where time and bacteria got to work. And yes, medieval folks were well aware that cheese had personalities. Some aged gracefully into firm, nutty wedges. Others turned gooey and aggressive. There's a delightful 13th century French account of a cheese that woke a bishop from fasting with its insistence. Whether that means it was pungent or simply bold in spirit is still debated by scholars and romantic cheese lovers alike. Monasteries once again played a starring role here. Cistercian and Benedictine monks, with their precise routines and access to resources, became unlikely cheese moguls. They refined recipes, documented methods, and occasionally named cheeses after saints, or sins, depending on the level of funk involved. Some of today's finest European cheeses trace their roots back to these patient, robe-clad artisans. And then there were the traveler cheeses, smaller wheels and firm blocks designed to be tied with leather straps and carried in sacks. Shepherds, pilgrims, even knights packed them on journeys, occasionally softening them over fire or grating them into broths. A firm sheep's cheese paired with a crust of bread and some dried fruit. That was a feast worth singing about, or at least grumbling less over. Of course, not all cheeses were glamorous. Some were little more than heavily salted lumps made from skimmed milk and stored in ash to keep flies away. Others had waxy rinds painted with herbs or clay. In alpine villages, families carved their initials into aging rounds so they wouldn't be swapped or borrowed during local cheese fairs. One surviving English complaint from 1394 reads, "Richard took my cheese and left me naught but rind," which frankly feels like an eternal human experience. And then there's the question of maggots. Yes, we must address it. In some regions, particularly where warmth and aging weren't always easy to balance, cheese became lively. While unintentional infestations were a disaster, there are scattered historical notes suggesting certain fermented cheeses with visible larvae were, in specific times and places, considered a delicacy. Historians still argue whether this was a regional tradition or desperation dressed in optimism. Either way, we'll stick with the salted varieties for now. Cheese also served a surprising role in diplomacy. Gifting a wheel of fine cheese to a visiting lord or bishop was a gesture of respect and hospitality. Some wheels were decorated with pressed herbs or wax seals, and larger households kept special knives just for cutting and serving cheese to guests. It was both food and formality. You sit now beside a soft wheel, its rind dusted with rosemary ash, aging quietly on its wooden shelf. The barn is still. Outside, the creek hums along. Somewhere above, a swallow flits through the rafters. And in this quiet, pungent, beautifully practical corner of the world, you realize that preserving milk wasn't just about survival. It was about transformation, about turning something fleeting into something enduring, complex, rich, imperfectly perfect. You close your eyes for a moment and imagine the first person to ever taste aged cheese, bold or foolish enough to cut into a moldy lump and try it anyway. A risk-taker, a pioneer, a very hungry optimist. The smell hits you before you see the source, a sharp, almost vinegary tang carried by the wind and woven with faint notes of barley and ale. You turn a corner and find yourself at the edge of a bustling medieval kitchen courtyard, where barrels of frothing liquid bubble quietly in the sun, and strings of herbs sway from every beam. This is the hidden realm of preservation through acidity, vinegar, ale, and other sour potions that once kept more than just food alive. At first glance, it doesn't look like much. A few jugs here, a foamy wooden bucket there. But step closer and you'll see that this is the backbone of every pickled onion, every kept cabbage, every last scrap of soaked meat that made it through summer into winter. These were the acidic guardians of the pantry, created by fermentation, luck, and the occasional accident. Let's start with vinegar. Simple, potent, and endlessly useful. Made by letting wine, ale, or fruit juice go past its prime, vinegar was both a preservation agent and a mild disinfectant. Anything it touched lasted longer, whether it was vegetables, meat, or linen soaked to clean wounds. The strong acidity deterred spoilage, and even better, vinegar didn't require rare ingredients, just time, warmth, and a willingness to forgive your wine for turning against you. In some kitchens, vinegar was crafted deliberately. Housewives and monks alike kept mother of vinegar cultures growing in ceramic pots, gelatinous colonies of acetic acid bacteria that looked like something from a wizard's cupboard. These mothers were stirred lovingly and passed down like sourdough starters. A particularly lively one might be named blessed or buried with honor if it died. Historians still argue whether some of these vinegar cultures were really passed on across generations, or whether people just liked the idea of having a grumpy old vinegar blob with ancestral gravitas. Then there's ale, not just for drinking, but for preserving and cooking too. Ale braising was a common technique, especially for meats, which might otherwise spoil in open kitchens. A joint of rabbit or beef could be slow cooked in ale, which helped mask any uncertainty in freshness. It wasn't just about flavor, it was about salvage. A well-seasoned ale stew could turn a slightly dodgy cut into something hearty, and more importantly, safe. Alewives, yes, that's the historical term, were often the chemical engineers of their communities. Brewing was traditionally a woman's job, managed from home and deeply tied to food preservation. These women brewed low-alcohol small ale for daily drinking and stronger batches for storage or trade. And since ale brewing created large volumes of mash, waste was minimal. Spent grains were fed to animals, used in bread, or, occasionally, mixed with vinegar to create tangy mash-based pickles. It was frugal, flavorful, and suspiciously modern. Vinegar-soaked cloths were also used to seal jars and crocks. You'd dip linen into vinegar, press it around the jar's mouth, and tie it with twine or wax. It kept air and insects out, and added a little extra acid kick to anything stored within. In wealthier homes, preserved lemons and other citrus rinds were soaked in vinegar and herbs, kept for use in sauces or as cures for sour stomachs. Monasteries noted them as digestives of notable sharpness. Here's a lovely fringe detail. In some towns, vinegar was used in place of holy water during outbreaks. People wiped their doorknobs, market coins, and even food parcels with it. Was it effective? Possibly, in a limited sense. Was it symbolic? Definitely. Vinegar became a kind of ritual, a sour shield against the unseen, And of course, vinegar and ale also featured heavily in social gossip. Brewing, like pickling, was often done in shared spaces. If someone's ale turned too sour or someone's vinegar bubbled a little too enthusiastically, tongues wagged. A 15th century letter mentions a neighbor's pickled onions smelling of witchcraft, which may or may not have been literal. Either way, preservation had social consequences. A spoiled batch could shame a household. A perfect pickle could elevate it. You lean now over a bubbling crock of ale stew, its surface slick with herbs and onion. The scent is deep, sour, sweet, faintly bitter. There's a calmness in the pot's rhythm, a quiet assurance that whatever meat lies beneath, it will be safe. It will be made edible. It will be enough. As the sun lowers, casting gold over the courtyard, you hear a distant laugh. Someone just dropped a vinegar pot, and now there's a rush of cloth and muttered curses. A cat darts away, tail held high, and in the midst of it all, the sour scent lingers, sharp but comforting. A reminder that even the humblest liquids, the leftover wine, the over-soured ale, could be coaxed into guardians of the pantry. A rooster crows somewhere behind you, but you're already wide awake, following the rhythmic scrape of a clay lid being pulled from a heavy pot. You're inside a small cottage now, one corner dim and fragrant with herbs and animal fat. The air is thick with the scent of rosemary, old grease, and faintly, clay. You've entered the last line of defense in medieval food preservation, the grease seal. While salt and vinegar may have ruled the obvious, many households turned to the subtler powers of fat and clay, two things that, when combined correctly, formed a surprisingly effective medieval Tupperware. What you see now is a crock of meat, likely duck or rabbit, sitting under a pale, solid lid of hardened lard. The meat was cooked, cooled, packed into the vessel, and smothered in fat, which hardened into an airtight barrier against bacteria, moisture, and anything with legs. The technique was known in some regions as confiting, and it wasn't just French nobles doing it. In fact, even modest households across Europe used variations of this method, especially during cold months or festival preparations. A well-packed crock of goose and fat could last several weeks in a cool pantry. A luxury? Certainly, but also an insurance policy. And it wasn't just animal fat. Beeswax, tallow, or even thick clay caps soaked in vinegar or ash were used to seal jars and pots. You could preserve cooked vegetables, fruits and syrup, or even herb pastes by layering them and topping them with a sealant that kept out the air and curious insects. It wasn't always perfect, but it often worked well enough. A curious fringe technique? In parts of Central Europe, cooked grains and legumes were packed tightly into jars and sealed not with fat, but with layers of cooled porridge that dried and hardened into a crust. The result was more edible lid than airtight barrier, but it often did the trick, especially for short-term storage. Was it elegant, number but functional? Surprisingly. And then we have the clay. Clay pots were the workhorse of medieval preservation. Unglazed ones allowed a bit of breathing. Glazed ones offered more protection. Some jars were painted with lime wash to keep them cooler in sunlight. Others were wrapped in damp cloths or half buried in earth to maintain a consistent temperature. These vessels weren't decorative, they were defensive, against heat, against air, and against the creeping dread of spoilage. In fact, some pots were made with built-in compartments, one side for food, one side for the sealing fat. You'd eat from one, refill from the other, always keeping a barrier between the contents and the outside world. Monasteries even developed large communal jars with complex wax seals stamped with the mark of the order. One particularly elaborate example from a Benedictine abbey included a looped handle so it could be hung from rafters, away from rats and small boys. Historians still argue whether these grease-sealing methods originated independently across Europe or were influenced by Roman or even Middle Eastern preservation practices. What's certain is that by the 14th century, they were everywhere. From the lard-sealed crock in the Welsh countryside to the clay-sealed lamb stew in Sicily, everyone seemed to agree. Air is the enemy. Of course, there were hazards. Improper sealing could lead to spoilage, or worse. A greasy surface might look solid but hide bacterial mischief beneath. Families learned to trust their noses. A sour scent, a change in color, or the dreaded fizz meant the crock had failed. And yet, In most cases, when properly sealed and stored, these fat-packed foods held up remarkably well, especially when buried in cool earth or stashed in the dark corners of cellars and barns. You lift a clay lid now and catch a glimpse of preserved rabbit leg, submerged in creamy white lard, speckled with bay leaves and thyme. The scent is savory, rich, and oddly timeless. Someone packed this with care, not just to feed a family, but to reassure them. That dinner was waiting, that the storm could pass, that hunger didn't always win. Outside, the wind picks up, rustling the herbs that hang from the rafters. The sunlight slides across the table, illuminating the cracked edge of a well-worn jar. And for a moment, you see the brilliance behind the simplicity, the fat that hardened into armor, the clay that cooled like a silent guardian. In a world that spoiled quickly, these methods bought time, and time was everything. You close the jar gently, the lid fitting snug with a soft thud. A seal, once again restored. In the quiet, you can almost hear the echo of generations past, cooks, monks, and mothers, leaning over crocks with spoons, stirring hope into each layer of fat and time. You wake to the sound of bells in the distance, soft, hollow, carrying over fields dusted with morning frost. It's the feast day of a small village saint whose name no one can quite remember. But what matters isn't the name, it's the food. Or more precisely, it's the fact that there is food, thanks to months of preserving, salting, drying, fermenting, and layering fat like protective spells in clay jars. Today is a good day, but not all days were, because while preserved food offered a kind of security, it was never perfect. No matter how well you salted your fish or pickled your pears, the medieval world could turn on you. A bad harvest, an early frost, or a mouse with an adventurous spirit could undo an entire season of work. And that's why food preservation wasn't just about technique. It was about rhythm. Feast or famine. Save when you can. Share when you must. Waste nothing. You step into the cottage now, where everything has been laid out with care. A smoked ham, hung for months above the hearth, now glistens as it's carved. Pickled onions crack softly as they're lifted from their jars. Dried herbs crumble into stews, and slices of preserved apple are folded into crusts thick enough to withstand a careless baking fire. It's not excess, it's resilience, a table not of luxury, but of memory. There's a saying in one old text: "The meal that is eaten slowly remembers the hands that prepared it." In this moment, you feel that. Each dish is a bookmark in a story told across seasons. The sausage links dried during harvest, the vinegar turned during a long rainy week, the cheese flipped daily in the cellar when the baby wouldn't sleep. Every preserved bite holds a season, a story, a survival, and not every winter ended with feasts. In years of plague, of drought, of bad luck and worse politics, the jars stayed sealed. Meals became thinner, hopes tighter. Sometimes a household would open a jar of pickled beets in January and know, this is the last one. Make it last. Make it matter. But in good years, preservation meant community. Salted fish shared with neighbors, honeyed plums brought to a birth, dried fruit tucked into a pocket before a journey. Monasteries sent vinegar tonics to sick villagers. Alewives offered their stronger batches to weddings and funerals alike. It wasn't just what was kept, it was what was given. Historians still argue whether medieval food preservation was more advanced than we give it credit for, or if we've over-romanticized a system born of necessity. But maybe it's both. There's something quietly brilliant in building your future, one jar at a time, in preparing for hunger even while you're full. You step outside now, breath steaming in the morning air. The fields are bare but not dead, just waiting. In the doorway, a woman brushes flour from her hands and tells a child to fetch the pickled leeks. The child groans, but goes. The rhythm continues. Because the truth is, preservation wasn't just about food. It was about trust. Trust in the method, in the weather, in the next season. You didn't seal a jar because you were greedy. You sealed it because you believed that winter would come. and also that it would end. And in that belief, there's peace, there's comfort. There's a promise tucked inside each pot, each salt crust, each syrup-soaked plum. You close your eyes. The fire crackles. The wind sighs softly. Everything is preserved. For now. And now is enough. So here you are, still, resting in the soft hush of a world long gone, but somehow still familiar. You've walked through cellars, crouched beside fires, lifted jars and lids and linen wraps. You've watched food age and change and last, and you've seen the quiet, careful hands behind it all, hands that stirred slowly, sealed tightly, and waited patiently. Let it slow now. Let the details soften. The roughness of a salt-encrusted fish, the golden shine of honey over plums, the quiet weight of cheese on a shelf, all fading gently into the background. Take a breath, in through the nose, cool even, out through the mouth, soft, slow. If you were there centuries ago, you'd have something in your cupboard. Not much, but enough. You'd eat a little, save a little, trade some, share some. You'd wrap your hope in fat and clay, hang it over your hearth, and trust that time would take care of it. And now, as you lie here, you can let that idea keep you warm. That preservation is care, and you've been cared for. You still are. Even now, the light is low, the kitchen is quiet, the jars are sealed, and the seasons are already turning. Sleep well. End of script. Sweet dreams.